Imagine a man who dedicates his existence to the idea that life is not just suffering, but an absolute dissolution process, an inexorable return to nothingness. A man who not only writes about death as an inevitable fate, but embraces it as the ultimate consequence of his thought. Philipp Mainländer is, without a doubt, the most radically pessimistic philosopher to have ever existed. His life and thought form an extreme argument for atheism. God is dead, but not because we killed him, rather because he chose to destroy himself. And if God died, then the universe is nothing more than a slow and agonizing implosion into nothingness, or at least, that is how Mainländer saw it. Mainländer took pessimism to an extreme even Schopenhauer dared not reach. To him, the will is not a creative principle, but a suicidal impulse permeating all existence. His metaphysical conception posits that reality is not the unfolding of a vital force, but the result of God's primordial self-destruction. At the very moment of his birth, God chose to extinguish himself, fragmenting into a multiplicity of entities that, far from being manifestations of a creative force, are simply the remnants of his disintegration. Thus, the universe is not an expression of vital energy, but a decaying corpse, whose only trajectory is the final collapse into absolute nothingness. Mainländer reinterprets Schopenhauer's will, turning it into a desire for self-destruction that governs all things. Instead of a force that manifests in the struggle for life, it is an inexorable drive toward death. Matter itself is nothing but the vestige of divine agony, an echo of that original act of annihilation. Every being, every individual consciousness, is a manifestation of this entropic process, which seeks, through wear, inertia, and extinction, to consummate itself definitively. Thus, existence is not a becoming in search of meaning, but a slow and painful decomposition, a funeral march whose only outcome is absolute nothingness. The cosmos, according to Mainländer, does not expand with the goal of flourishing but of disintegrating. There is no teleology, no purpose. Life is nothing more than the transmission of suffering from one being to another, a kind of self-destructive chain in which each generation drags along the burden of an existence it never asked for, yet is forced to endure. Mainländer belongs to a deeply pessimistic philosophical tradition, but his vision is uniquely radical. While Schopenhauer spoke of the will as a blind and irrational force that condemned beings to an existence of endless suffering, he still left room for a certain kind of liberation through art, compassion, and contemplation. Mainländer, on the other hand, denies any form of redemption. There is no consolation, no escape, only an inevitable tendency toward nothingness. Nietzsche represents the greatest contrast to Mainländer, where the latter sees dissolution and death as the final destiny of all beings. Nietzsche responds with an affirmation of life, with the will to power as a creative drive that shapes and gives meaning to the world. For Nietzsche, the death of God is not a cause for despair, but an opportunity for humanity to take control of its own destiny and create new values. In this sense, Mainländer's philosophy is the antithesis of Nietzschean thought. Instead of the overcoming of man, Mainländer predicts his inevitable extinction. Even in his time, his ideas were considered extreme. He never achieved the recognition Schopenhauer had in his lifetime, nor the influence Nietzsche would later wield. His philosophy of redemption went relatively unnoticed compared to other works of the era. However, it left an indelible mark on philosophical thought, inspiring some existentialist and nihilist thinkers of the 20th century. Mainländer's relationship with existentialism is ambiguous. While philosophers, like Sartre and Camus, accepted the absence of transcendental meaning, yet advocated for an affirmation of individual freedom. Mainlander saw no room for autonomy or the construction of one's own meaning. For him, life was not an opportunity for creation, but a condemnation that could only be resolved through annihilation. His vision of the universe as a process of decomposition distances him from Camus' active existentialism and brings him closer to an absolute nihilism, where the only certainty is dissolution. In his masterpiece, The Philosophy of Redemption, Mainlander formulates his theory of God's death and the natural tendency of the universe toward annihilation. To him, happiness is nothing but the progressive reduction of being into non-being. It is not pleasure that defines existence, but the slow process of disappearance. This idea radically opposes any philosophy that seeks a positive meaning in life. If Schopenhauer still granted the possibility of a certain liberation through art or contemplation, Mainlander denies any form of salvation. The only destiny is nothingness. In this sense, his thought prefigures certain contemporary currents of nihilism, where the absence of meaning is not just a possibility but a certainty. Yet, while some nihilists see this as a starting point for constructing new values, Mainlander sees it as confirmation that existence is, ultimately, a mistake. But what makes Mainlander such a disturbing figure is not just his own death, but the way his philosophy destroys any glimmer of metaphysical hope. If God ever existed, then his first and final desire was to die. And if the universe is the result of that death, then life is nothing more than the slow decomposition of a divine corpse. And yet, here we are, living, breathing, facing the abyss that Mainlander outlined with his philosophy, but also defying it. If life has no transcendental meaning, perhaps that frees us from the burden of seeking it outside ourselves. If everything is doomed to dissolve, then every existing moment is a miracle in itself. We do not need eternity to give value to what we are. The simple fact of being here, feeling, thinking, and choosing is enough. Perhaps, instead of seeing the universe as a collapse, we can see it as a fleeting but profoundly meaningful spark. If this reflection made you think, I invite you to share your opinion in the comments. What do you think about Mainlander's vision? Do you believe the absence of transcendental meaning condemns us or frees us? If you're interested in exploring these questions further, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next video.